Hello, and welcome to Adler Astronomy Live. I'm your host, Chris, and today we're talking about the science, art, and history of constellations. Now, as you can see, we're all currently in our homes trying on some new online programming, and because of these fun circumstances, you may get some sweet bonus material, such as my 5-month-old testing out their vocal range, or a neighbor mowing their lawn, or maybe a technical difficulty. But we ask that you join us on this journey, whatever technical bumps might be on it, and get ready to take this journey through the history of constellations. Now, since the building is closed, guests don't have physical access to our collections and historical objects, but we're going to bring those to you today digitally. You have your very own behind the scenes tour. Today, we're going to be looking at objects that focus on constellations and sky knowledge in culture. So with us today are some wonderful guests, Jessica Brody-Frank and Pedro Raposo. Jessica is our collections digital access manager who works to provide digital access to our historic collections. Hello, good afternoon, Jessica.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, and then we have Pedro Raposo, PhD, who's a historian of science and curator, and the director of collections at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. Raposo oversees the Adler's world-class collections of astronomical instruments, prints, and rare books at the Adler. Hello, Pedro.
Hello, Chris and everyone.
So glad you could all join us. Today's program is meant to be interactive. We'd love for you to ask questions throughout the program, utilizing the YouTube chat. If you have questions or comments right now, you can even just throw up, hey, where are you joining us from? We'd love to hear from you. This is a conversation. We'd love to be having this in person, but of course we can't. But Colleen is in the chat right now. She'll be taking your questions and interacting with you. But to get us started, Pedro, so just so we're all on the same page here, can you tell us what exactly is a constellation?
Sure. So a constellation is primarily a pattern that people identify in the night sky. When you look at the night sky on a clear night with no clouds and ideally with no moonlight, you see plenty of dots of light which seem to be randomly distributed against a dark background. So what our brains immediately will try to do is to find order. And so we start connecting the dots. So we pick up the brightest stars, we start making connections, and people all over the world in different places, cultures through the ages have done this collectively. As a result of that, several different traditions of sky knowledge and constellations emerge. There is a specific tradition, and we'll hear more about that today, that took a hold in the West. And so it became associated with the rise of modern astronomy. But as astronomers kept on mapping the sky ever more accurately, it became clear that, well, some astronomers favored some constellations to the detriment of others. Some would come up with their very own constellations that others were not very fond of. And it was not always clear when one constellation ended and the neighbor constellations began. So in the 1920s, astronomers, in the context of the International Astronomical Union, decided to pick up on the 88 constellations that were the more consensual in this Western tradition. Mm-hmm. And as you can see on your screens right now, they divided the sky into 88 very well-defined regions, each of one corresponding to a constellation. So there are 88 of them. This means that for scientific purposes, for common scientific reference, we have this kind of agreed upon map of 88 constellations. So nowadays, a constellation, scientifically, it's a well-defined area of the sky, and there are 88 of them. But it's important to remark that constellations have a very rich history. And when we look at the history of constellations, we will learn more than just about astronomy. Constellations are about culture, art, mentalities, societies, and social change. And in our collections, we have plenty of great historical artifacts that help us better understand that story and share that story with others. And that's what we want to do. We want to do a bit of that today, precisely.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, since you are our collections digital access manager, could you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so like Pedro said, we have a great collection at the Adler. We have over 3,000 objects. So that's your physical, three-dimensional globes, astrolabes, telescopes. But we also have 9,000 rare books. And, you know, a lot of those are actually illustrated. So there are some like fun, pretty elements. It's not just like a lot of words. But we also have over 100,000 archival objects. So we have a lot of objects in our collection. As a part of that, we have over 4,000 constellation depictions. So as Pedro said, there's 88 official constellations, and we have over 4,000 depictions of them. So it really is something that you can track culture and art and history through.
Sure.
So we spent a large proportion of our time in 2016 through 2018 working on a grant through NEH to digitize all 4,000 plus depictions.
Wow.
So those are now available, and we're going to show them to you. Not all 4,000, but
yeah.
some.
And not yet. I want this to be the teaser right here. Well, I have a quick question though. So the stuff that we're seeing today, even if I were to go into the Adler, would I even be able to see these? Or is this kind of like a behind the scenes tour?
Yeah, we're pretty behind the scenes right now. We have some of what you're going to see today is available in the Chicago Night Sky exhibit.
Okay.
And some of them are within our Universe in Your Hands exhibits with the history of astronomy on some of our globes. But you're seeing a lot. We do not get to show all 4,000 depictions on the floor. So this is kind of a nice behind the scenes way to pull those in for you guys.
Awesome. And I guess since the Adler's doors are closed, everything is technically behind the scenes. So
yeah, we're all special now.
Right. You're all special. So for any of us just joining us, this is Adler Astronomy Live with the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. My name is Chris. I'm your host, and we're talking all about constellations. So if you're enjoying this episode, we'd love if you could consider donating to the Adler's annual Celestial Ball fundraiser happening September 12th. This year, the gala is totally digital, and every donation helps us continue to bring space science to everyone, everywhere. It's going to be a special night. Any amount is welcome and appreciated. Maybe it's, I don't know, $88 for the number of official constellations we have, maybe, or perhaps 12 for the number of constellations we have in the zodiac. But since it's virtual, for the first time this year, anyone watching this, anyone at all, no matter where you are, can come to the gala. So Colleen is sharing the link to donate in the chat, and your donations will allow us to continue to bring exciting online programs like this to you while our building is closed to the public. Well, Jessica, as people are just pouring out their pockets for the good of science and humanity, can you tell us, where do constellations come from?
Yeah, like Pedro said at the beginning, this is pretty much a cultural norm. In almost every culture in the world, people looked up at the stars and tried to make sense of the patterns. Pedro kind of mentioned it's very useful to see these patterns when you're trying to do things like navigation, timekeeping, you're looking at seasonal changes. And one of the easiest ways is really to put some art in it and see an actual image up there. A lot of us automatically in our minds do this connecting the dots and trying to form a picture. And so the earliest ones we have on record are almost 5,000 years old, and they come out of Mesopotamia. And so that's really where the root of this is. But what we tend to think of in the Western canon come out of Greek mythology. So that's when you're watching, Disney's Hercules movies and you're hearing all of the names and you see them up in the stars. That's kind of coming out of what's really the 2nd century astronomer Ptolemy. So that was taking Greek mythology stories and mapping them into the skies in regions so that you could actually see entire stories play out within a certain section. So that's how you start to see some of that you'll start to see as we show you are kind of sectioned out so that you can keep track of that story, and it's easier in your head. You know who's all in that, who's the characters, and they're up there for you to see. And so if we're talking at that point, that's the 2nd century. As we kind of progress, as Pedro mentioned, different cultures start adapting different constellations. But even the Western canon goes from 48 constellations to many more.
Wow.
And we get to the point where we're looking at this book that's from the 1600s. And it really becomes an art form. You now know what the constellations are going to look like, and people can put their own spin on it.
Yeah, I can see that. Even I have an art background, and like looking at some of these beautiful images, well, it gives a personal relationship to the sky. And also, I'll be honest, it kind of makes me want to make my own constellations myself, seeing these beautiful illustrations.
Well, I have good news for you, Chris, and for every art fans and artists watching this. So actually, we picked up some images of constellations from rare books in our collections that are among the first Western printed books showing constellations and telling the stories of constellations. And we brought some of those images together. We picked up specifically images of animal constellations because we know people like animals. And we created a coloring book, which you should be seeing on your screens. which is titled The Celestial Zoo. So what we'll get here is a selection of those depictions, early printed depictions of animal constellations. And so you can color them, you can add your own embellishments, you can tweak with the creatures a little bit, and you will also get a bit of background for each constellation. I must make a note here, though, that you might be surprised with some of the depictions of those animal constellations, because some of them don't really correspond to what you think that respective animal would look like. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Well, the reason is that the people who are making these drawings, so these were basically woodcuts in this case.
Yeah.
So they were based on what either in some cases they might have seen an animal. Some of the animals are actually imaginary. And in some cases the animals are real, but people who were making these drawings had to rely on what they had seen on other books, or had to rely on what they had heard about the animals.
Well, what is that?
So the result could be a bit weird sometimes.
Yeah.
And to give everyone an idea of how intriguing these old depictions of animal constellations can be, we have a little poll here, a little game. So we will invite our audience to guess what the right answer is. So this is a depiction of an animal constellation. What is this supposed to be? 4 options. We may say, well, pretty much every option could be true, but only one of them corresponds to the animal this is supposed to represent.
Yeah, I was gonna put my money on like elephant shark.
Let's see, but the options we have are: is it a swordfish, dolphin, sea monster, or sea monkey?
I feel like this is definitely indicative of the fact that people were playing a game of telephone, basically, with describing this animal.
Yep. Yeah, like I saw something on the high seas and I come back, I'm like, Jessica, guess what I saw? Oh shoot, I was really seasick. Let me try to explain it. It had one massive tusk, I know that. Yep,
for sure, one tusk.
I wanted to take a quick moment. Thank you so much for reaching out in the chat while people are doing their polls. GSDSW asks, are constellations, Pedro, I'll get this to you. Are constellations limited to seeing the stars with the naked eye, or are there deep space constellations?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Well, constellations essentially emerge out of what you can see with your unaided eye. Of course, that when astronomers, especially say from the 17th century onwards, started to have telescopes and mapping the skies more accurately and having access to stars that we cannot see with our unaided eye, they will include sometimes those stars on their maps of constellations. But constellations are primarily something that emerges out of the experience of looking at the sky with your unaided eye.
Okay. Another question we have.
Stars that you cannot see, let me just make this remark, please.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Cannot see are still part of that constellation if they are in that area of the sky, that's for sure.
Megan asks, are there any good ways to identify constellations in a city like Chicago where there's a lot of light? And I want to piggyback. Also, John asks, can astronomers just walk out in the middle of the day and know where the stars are without even seeing them?
Well, two very interesting questions. So I'll pick up on the Chicago question first. We normally see, well, the cities have a lot of light pollution. You cannot see that many stars. I've been a keen stargazer for many years, and I grew up in Portugal in a small industrial town when we had a lot of light pollution, and I still managed to create an astronomy club with friends. So what we did, we only see a few stars in the night sky, but that's actually advantageous, because if you begin with a few stars and you start identifying them and recognizing their relative positions, then you create your points of reference. And then when you finally have the opportunity to go to a place with a really dark sky with plenty of stars, you already have points of reference. So I encourage everyone, if you are in a city, yes, even if you just can see 2 or 3 stars, try to identify them. Come to the Adler's website. We have resources, we have shows, we have events that help you identify those constellations in the sky. To the question, if you go out, even if it's daytime or you cannot see the sky, do you know where constellations are? Well, you can actually easily use software and tools to know where the constellations are. Yeah, you can see them because of the sun, of course, of the sunlight, but yeah, they are there.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much for all your questions in the chat. We'll get to more. I wanted to move on to our poll responses. it looks like 50% say monster.
Mhm.
Um,
I think we can all agree with that.
Maybe.
yeah. Oh, what? Really?
Yeah. So I think everybody was thinking of my favorite constellation, which is Cetus, who gets the bad rap of being the sea monster. But this is actually Delphinius the dolphin.
Okay, 6 people did say dolphin, but I would have
Yeah.
not guessed dolphin.
Yeah. It doesn't look like what you see at the aquarium.
No.
I think the shows at the aquarium would be very different
Yeah.
if this is what the dolphin looked like.
I can imagine. I can imagine. So this one's weird, Pedro. I almost hesitate to ask, but do you have any weirder ones?
Oh yeah, of course we are. Of course, what counts as weird will be different.
Well, that's fair.
Yes, but we certainly do.
Yeah.
For example, we know there are many constellations in the sky that, for example, are technological objects, technological artifacts. And if maybe somehow you can still look at the stars in the constellation of the dolphin and figure out some kind of shape that should suggest a dolphin, we have constellations that are actually artifacts that I say it's quite of a stretch of the imagination to see them. And we have another exercise poll here for folks to get an idea about those weirder constellations.
Sure.
I'll let Jessica read this one.
Yeah, so what we're looking at now, what is it supposed to be? Is it a sewing machine, an air pump, a workbench, or a coffee maker?
Well, okay, so we're gonna give people time to talk about this, but even as I'm seeing these answers, Jessica, I'm thinking of what objects these objects in the sky, constellations are normally made from cultures, what they normally see. Maybe they see them out in sea, maybe they see them around us. In this land of quarantine, what we're seeing day to day is pretty much the same. If you were to make a quarantine constellation, what do you think it would be?
There's always a temptation to actually, go for the coffee maker.
That's what spawned my.
Maybe because it's there already, but
Right.
I would probably make a constellation for my dog.
Okay.
I think there's a couple dogs up there now, but I think we're almost at 6 months into the quarantine here in Chicago, so she's keeping me sane at the moment.
And Pedro, do you have one too?
Oh, of course. If I'm allowed, I would like to request 2 constellations. So one will be the electric guitar.
Be greedy.
Another one will be the amplifier, of course, because if you don't have an amplifier, it's worthless having an electric guitar. So yeah.
Electric guitar and an amplifier. Fantastic. Technology in the sky.
Absolutely. Talking of which.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do we have results in for what people think this one is?
Let's look. Okay. 41% say air pump. Air pump?
Yeah.
Air pump. It is air pump. What?
Air pump, yes.
You just have to change
a beautiful air pump in the sky.
So we have a question. Which hemisphere is this in, this air pump?
This is actually Southern Hemisphere. And this is a great segue to kind of talk about why these constellations emerge. And I can tell you a bit more about that. So basically, as we have been mentioning here, so constellations are very much connected with people's culture. And of course, what people see in the sky, I doubt that anyone would say, I will create an electric guitar constellation 600 years ago. So I'll be very surprised with that. Of course, what we see in the sky reflects our culture and our times, right? So what happens that in 1751, a French astronomer whose name was Nicolas Louis de Lacaille, he went down to South Africa, to the Cape of Good Hope, to map the southern skies. And I have to remark that there are parts of the southern sky that you cannot see if you are in Europe because they will never come above the horizon. So you have to go down to the southern hemisphere. Of course, that people living in the southern hemisphere had already created their own constellation and filled up the southern sky with their own patterns and their own constellations. But for Europeans, this was still, in a sense, a new territory. So Lacaille, as he is mapping the southern...
Oh, Pedro.
I think we got stuck.
We've frozen with Pedro for a second. Wow. So we'll go to the questions while we're pausing on Pedro really quickly here.
Hopefully he comes back.
Hopefully he comes back. We miss you already, Pedro. But really quickly, who is that Delphinius illustration by? Jessica, do you have any idea?
Ooh, that one in particular, we have quite a few of them. I'm trying to remember which one we pulled that from. It was not the Bayer Atlas, because those are in color.
Yeah, these are great questions. Keep them coming. We're so excited to talk to you all out there.
That one might take a minute.
Oh, that's absolutely.
I do know that one's from the 1400s, so it's definitely one of our older ones.
Yeah.
It's just only a few of the names of the makers stick in your head.
Yep.
The year I always can get, but it's that maker name.
Yeah, absolutely. Viv Aziz asks, what are the best things to look out for, or what to do, or what you need to look at stars? What are the best things to look out for to look at stars?
I think
this might be to identify constellations.
Yeah, if we're looking to identify constellations, like Pedro said, there are a lot of ways you can kind of do that from just your naked eye, but you can also do things like telescope observing. One of the best ways I've been able to start learning how to actually go out and see them is some of the Adler's programmings like Skywatch Weekly. Actually, Nick Lake, who hosts that show, will very often highlight what constellations are visible that day.
That's a great,
and that can be very helpful for someone like me who doesn't really understand what seasons constellations come out in. I remember some from like little nursery rhymes about like Orion and Scorpio have to stay apart, and so they're on the opposite sides. But that's the way Nick usually kind of highlights that every week, and that's really helpful.
Yeah.
And Nick actually will use some of the images from our collection to help highlight that, so you'll see even more.
There's another question was, where's the best place in the world to watch constellations from?
I think, again, that's going to depend on what constellations you're looking for. So if you're looking for these southern ones, which we'll get back to in a second, you have to be in the southern hemisphere. You can't see those from up here. And even depending on where you are in the northern hemisphere, certain constellations won't be as well visible.
Right.
So there are some that are better to see from, like, if you're going to be in a much northern section of, let's talk about Canada, Iceland, Norway, these places that people go to see the Aurora Borealis. You'll see some of the constellations better up there.
I'll also know that even close to the city, Indiana Dunes, only an hour away, is a great place to see the night sky. There's also the Little Red Schoolhouse is a partner of the Adler Planetariums that we've been working on, designated an urban night sky place, and you can see so many stars just from a short drive or a short trip away.
Yeah. Should we just
let's dive back into let's dive back into some of these beautiful images while we wait for Pedro to. We hope for Pedro to join us. So great. So
let's highlight what he was kind of trying to finish off there.
Go for it.
So kind of what Pedro was talking about with this image here. So this was by the astronomer Lacaille. He was a French astronomer. This is the southern hemisphere. So we're looking at this one made in around I think like 1600s is when he created this. A lot of the southern constellations start getting really fleshed out from a Western perspective between the 16 and the 1700s.
Okay.
The reason I'm going to stress from a Western perspective is, like we said, cultures were already doing it there.
Okay.
What we have is almost a perfect storm of two separate ideals in that time period that help fill up the sky from a Western perspective. One of them is the Enlightenment. So that's this idea of a huge focus on science, on art, on culture. And so this is a Western time period where we see a lot of what we know now is like the great literary works are made and great scientific discovery is going on and the scientific method comes out. And so it's like a golden age for these kinds of discoveries. And so once that's important to you, you start to fill the sky with it. So we actually have constellations in the southern hemisphere that are known as the easel, the sculptor table, the sextant, the ruler even is in there. So they're filling it up with instruments that are just really important in their cultural connection with the Enlightenment.
Yep.
The other piece of it is a little bit maybe more insidious piece of that time period, especially from a Western perspective.
Go on.
And so we're going to talk about the big one, which is colonialism.
Right.
So the entire reason that they're in the Southern Hemisphere at this point is colonialism. It's not necessarily just a tourist destination. This is a colonial expansion that we're talking about.
Thank you for highlighting that.
Just going to say it here. So part of that actually reflects in our constellations as well.
Okay.
So some of the southern constellations, there's only about 14 that are instruments. And as we said, there are 88 total. So there's more than 14 in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
The ones that we're going to see right now that are absolutely beautiful, but there is some issues with them. We actually have a constellation called the Indian, which is
that passing by. Yes.
Yeah. But we also get ones like the peacock, the birds of paradise, the chameleon. These are animals they hadn't seen before, native to Western Europe, even Eastern Europe. And there's a big exoticism during this time period of all of these things that they're finding in these colonial ports that they're going to. Can I
ask you a question? This is actually a question from the chat, but this is an interesting question. How did people agree on the shape, or like what constellation was chosen? I think you sort of highlighted that a little bit, but
so we talk about it a little bit, but it's kind of a winner takes all situation. So people made their own constellations, and then it kind of becomes whoever gets it published, whoever gets brought into the cultural zeitgeist, and it becomes kind of a whoever gets there first and whoever then gets picked up. Because we're going to see later some constellations that people made that did not get picked up. And we have things in our collection, like people went back through all of the constellations and decided that it was their religious moral duty to turn them into saints. So instead of having Orion, you have, St. Peter. And so they completely changed all. That did not pick up. It did not become a thing
apparently
people carried on.
I don't look up at St. Peter in the night sky. You're right. Yeah.
But it's something that people can do whatever they want. That's what we said. We could go outside tomorrow and I could decide there's a toaster in the stars, and that's what I'm going to call it. And that's fine. You can do what you want with the patterns, but it is definitely, once it takes hold and kind of who gets published, who gets cited, where does it then become people making copies of it, that kind of picks it up. Yeah. And now we have the IAU, which decided these are the 88 and that's it.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more? So you're sort of talking about this with like cultural connection, story connection, religious connection, but can you talk a little bit more about what were constellations used for?
Yeah, so Pedro kind of mentioned it at the beginning of this. One of the ways that constellations kind of get set is the very earliest piece that we came out of with the Greeks is that it's to put some morals in your life. So that's what we're looking at here. And I can let Pedro jump back in. Sorry, we lost you there.
Going to a wormhole. And,
it's fine. It's fine.
To crawl back. All right.
Jessica was saying how constellations can put.
Right.
Yeah, she was saying how constellations can put morals back into our lives.
Yeah. All right. So here on your screens, you have some really nice pictures. I don't know how much you have said already about this. So these are all
just got here.
Story, which is associated with the Greek myth of Perseus and Andromeda. And so Perseus and Andromeda, and also the sea monster Cetus, which you see on the bottom right. So these are all part of the same story. And basically the story goes, and there are different versions, but the main version is that the mother of Andromeda, Cassiopeia, was very vain, and she told the Greek god of sea, Poseidon, that she and Andromeda were more beautiful than the nymphs of the sea, and Poseidon was very angry, and so chained Andromeda to a rock so that she would be devoured by the sea monster as punishment. But fortunately, of course, there's a Hollywood ending to this. Perseus shows up, and he has just beheaded the Medusa. You see the head of the Medusa with her serpent's hair, and even being her head having been severed, everything that the Medusa looks at will turn into stone. So basically, Perseus holds the head of the Medusa in front of the sea monster, and the sea monster turns into stone, and then he rescues Andromeda. Okay, so this is the kind of story that you have projected onto the stars. I can't tell you exactly what the exact meaning of purpose of this myth is, but I can easily imagine people in ancient Greece and other parts where this myth was also valid, sitting down under the stars, and there will be a moment of storytelling, and you could pick on parts of these stories. For example, well, you see Cassiopeia, she defied the gods. Be careful. Don't mess with the powers that be. Or, for example, you have monsters here, the Medusa and Cetus. This might be maybe an allegory of the fight against evil and the fight against our deepest fears that we have to overcome them. Or, for example, you could use this to celebrate the heroic virtues or someone who goes rescue somewhere else. So you see, constellations turn the sky into a picture book. And this is very usual for communities to do storytelling and to talk about how life should be in that community. So this was certainly one important cultural function of constellations. But then constellations, of course, have very practical and scientific functions as well. For example, here we are looking at an object from our collection, but you see it's tiny, so it's a pocket. Do you have an idea of what this might be?
It's like one of those, I think it's a chocolate, one of those chocolate oranges, but like an old one, really old.
It's not, Chris, because if we had that in the collection, I would have eaten it by now. So no, it's not an edible object. It's actually a pocket Ori. So an Ori is a mechanical model of the solar system. This is a specific case. You see the sun at the center, two other little globes. That's the Earth and the Moon, and you see the mechanism, the gears. So basically, you can actually put this in motion, and look here, inside of the lid, you see the constellation. So this is truly a mini Adler Planetarium that you could carry in your pocket from the early 19th century, made in London. Okay, but I want to tell you about those constellations you see all around the mechanical model. Yes. Those are the 12 constellations of the zodiac, and everyone is familiar with these constellations. So Taurus the bull, Gemini the twins, and so on and so on. Why are these constellations so important? If you start keeping track of the apparent motion of the sun in the celestial sphere and the motions of the moon and the planets, you will always find them along a band in the sky that goes all around the sky, and which is formed by these 12 constellations. So these constellations were really important to track down the motions of the celestial cycles, and that was very important for us to keep track of time. Imagine an agricultural society needing to know the best times for planting and harvesting. You keep track of the celestial motions, and then we start having calendars. So this is how our sense of time emerges, really. And so these constellations were extremely helpful in that regard.
Now, constellations, people are continuously putting a lot of like personal relationships to constellations, either the zodiac. So I know I'm a Sagittarius, and I just recently learned that that means that if I'm a Sagittarius, what was at high noon in the sky, but like basically behind the sun, would have been the constellation Sagittarius on my birth or whatever.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
How do we know? Yeah, how do we know that the constellation was back there? How do we know what's behind the sun?
Excellent question, Chris. Of course, these constellations are very important in astrology, where people, of course, try to derive something about their own lives and fortunes and personalities from the stars. So that's old knowledge too. And astronomy and astrology were basically two sides of the same coin up to the 17th century. That old knowledge of astronomy doesn't really apply today in terms of the positions of the sun and the constellations, but your question is an excellent one, Chris. How do we know? So we cannot look directly at the sun, and as someone from our audience very aptly asked, so if during the daytime are the constellations still there? Excellent question too, which relates to your question. Okay, so how do you know? So you can do two things. So you basically wait for sunset, and then you wait until you see the first stars appearing in the direction of the sun. You can do the same at sunrise, before sunrise. So if you already know the sequence of constellations, you can derive that. But ancient astronomers already had another trick, which was they knew that when the moon is full, the moon is opposite the sun. So if you know, and that you can see in the sky, you see in which constellation the full moon is, so you will know that the sun will be in the opposite constellation. And if you already know the sequence, it will be easy to figure that out.
Yeah. Okay, that's amazing. This is a lovely question from Megan. What's the first constellation you remember seeing in the night sky, Jessica?
Oh, I know exactly. Mine was Orion. I knew Orion before I knew it was Orion. Yeah, because the pattern is so easy to recognize in the winter sky. And again, let me highlight this. It was from my industrial hometown with a lot of light pollution, but I could see that constellation, and it was really intriguing.
I think the one I can still see in Chicago is usually Orion, but the one I remember most as a kid was definitely Ursa Major, Ursa Minor. So like we were big with all of the different names for like the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper. And it was all these stories that we heard in school, at home. And those were the two I think I most remember always trying to find.
Me too. I remember trying to sleep out in the night sky in a sleeping bag, and that was the one I could see. So Jessica, we've talked a lot about Western constellations. What about constellations outside of Europe?
Actually, first though, because we just did mention Ursa Major, Ursa Minor.
Oh, please.
Pedro, do you want to tell us how you can use those for navigation?
Oh, absolutely. Great idea.
I'm glad you brought her up, Jessica, because we still have yet another beautiful object here. What you see on your screens, this is called a compendium. This was made in by the middle of the 16th century in England, we believe. Imagine a sort of a Swiss Army knife, but for astronomy. So you have plenty of different instruments in the same piece. Right now, you see that's a sundial. You see a compass.
Yeah.
And next, you will see a round disc, which has a map of the world.
Does that open up?
You can actually flip that over.
Yeah.
And which I will do. So that's, again, my hand in the video. So here, when you flip it over, you open it up, you unfold it, doing that very gently. There you have the Great Bear and the Little Bear, and an instrument. So this is an instrument called the Nocturnal, which I'm holding right now in my hand. And see that there's a moving part we call the alidade. You might also have noticed there's a hole at the center. So what you do with this instrument is you make sure to see the pole star through the hole. And to find the pole star, you will use the Big Dipper, which is part of the Great Bear. And you will use two stars specifically, which are the pointers. So those basically point to the pole star, which is part of the Little Bear. Then what you'll do, you will align that movable part of the instrument. So again, remember, you're seeing the pole star through the hole, and then you will align that movable part with the pointers in the Big Dipper. And then you can read the time in the instrument. Why was this important? This was extremely important because if you were approaching a port, and this happened, for example, in the ports, the eastern ports of the United States in the colonial era, you had to wait for the high tide in order to get safely into the port. So it was useful to know the time so that you could make at least a rough tide prediction. But the pole star was important for other functions too. Of course, it's also known as the North Star, so it gives you direction. Also, navigators also had instruments that they could use to measure the altitude of the pole star above the horizon. That will give them the latitude. So here's a good example of how constellations are also useful for navigation.
So since a lot of people don't have one of these beautiful objects at home to find the constellations and navigate by them, there's a question in the chat. Do you have an astrolabe, or what apps do you use to find constellations in the night sky? I know me personally, I'm on Android and I use what's called Sky Map.
Yeah, I think I use the same. Yes. That's a good question. Yeah.
I use on Apple products, I use the app Night Sky.
Night Sky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I also use Stellarium.
Stellarium?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well,
can I just make a note?
Please.
This was actually a very good remark. Not everyone has one of these objects at home. I have to remark that object is a very fanciful one. So that was a showpiece. Navigators used kind of more, instruments that were cheaper, made of wood, etc. That was a showpiece, just to show the concept.
Thank you. So it looks like, Jessica, you can answer. We're moving from Western constellations outside of Europe.
We are. We gave a lot of time to our Western constellations, but But I think it's important to note that even in Western constellations, when we are saying that these Greek mythology based are, Enlightenment colonial based constellations, they are also adapted though by other cultures. So even though we have mentioned that there are very rich traditions from Native Americans, Maori, Polynesian, there are other cultures that adapt the kind of Western canon. So what we're looking at here on the left is a Mercator globe. So this is a very traditional globe from a Western canon. You can kind of make out there that there's Hercules on there, the Gemini are on there. You kind of recognize those. If you actually look on the right and you kind of don't let the artistic style get you, they're the same constellations. So this is a globe from Lahore, which is modern day Pakistan. And this is in the Mughal style. So this is a 1600s blend of Persian and Islamic. And it's very beautiful, very distinctly Islamic style globe. But what they did is they adapted the Western constellations, because in the 1600s, there was a huge amount of reciprocity back and forth between Western scientists, Islamic scientists. A lot of what we consider, modern day astronomy came out of Islamic astronomers. And so they actually just adapted those constellations and then put it in their artistic style. But that's not the only option. We actually see that people kind of have their own traditions, and the Eastern tradition that comes out of China is what we're looking at here. So this is one of probably my favorite objects at the Adler. It's an absolutely gorgeous print from China.
This is beautiful.
Yes. I think we cannot show this piece enough, but also recognize that this is a very large print. When we have it on site at the Adler, it covers 3 very oversized storage cabinets. So we're talking about this is a very large object.
Wow.
But this, if you actually look in on it, the Chinese tradition did not use figurative constellations. So when I'm saying that, they don't put a picture over top. They rely on line and dot constellations. And they don't use the Western canon. They made their own patterns. So even though they call it, a dragon constellation, they're not going to put a figurative dragon over it. This is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's very beautiful. It's very stylized, but it makes more sense for their culture, for their values, and then how they're going to artistically render it.
Yeah. As an artist, could I just ask real quick?
Yeah.
How is this made? I immediately want to do this, or it's beautiful.
Yeah. So this one's actually, if you kind of understand like a woodcut block system, so that's Western printing, early printing. You would kind of carve it out. On this one, it's actually the opposite. You carve in your pattern, and then when you rub that blue ink on it and press it down, that paper was originally probably more of a white color, and now you've got the blue over top because you carved your constellations into it, so it's only printing everything around it.
So the paper has the paper sunk down into those carvings basically, and then
and then you get that print over top. So to me, it actually makes more sense than when you're trying to think of in Western cultures, it's like you reverse it and you have to cut around what you want to come out. I think that would be so much more difficult and not something I can actually accomplish, but that's how you come up with something beautiful like this. But I think the important part is that they actually see a similar adoption of Chinese constellations outside of China. So you actually see these picked up throughout Eastern Asia. So what we're going to show you now is actually a Japanese book we have. And as a note, Pedro is not wearing gloves here because we don't wear gloves when we handle rare books and paper-based artifacts, because it's actually harder for you to feel it and you're more likely to tear the paper than any damage from your skin. We wash our hands first, it's fine. Just before anybody puts it in the chat, Pedro did the right thing here. But these are some Japanese constellations.
Yeah.
And so what's great about this is it shows that other cultures adapt from the cultures that are around them, or cultures that maybe are more like what their culture represents. So even though China and Japan were very much not in agreement for much of, this history, they adopted Chinese constellations, and then use the Japanese kanji and put it over top and make their own map. And again, it's very stylized, it's very beautiful, but they're not going to use figures. They're not going to kind of do it in the Western tradition. This is the Eastern Asian style of constellations.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to thank everyone watching right now for all the great questions that are going on in the chat. This has been a wonderful conversation we're having with you all. BK Pope asks, says, this is great. Thank you, BK Pope. You're great. What advice do you have for a young person who wants to focus on astronomy as a career? Pedro,
Okay.
Jessica?
Yeah.
Well, I think, well, since none of us is an astronomer proper, I would say that perhaps we can put this member of our audience in contact with our astronomers at the Adler, and I think they will be able to provide very good advice on what to do. So this will be my suggestion.
How about your,
I was going to say, the one thing I would say that we've told some of the teens who intern at the Adler is that, as Pedro mentioned, none of us are astronomers. We're just really passionate about the piece that we do. So Pedro is a very passionate historian of science, medicine, technology, and this is kind of how he got roped in here. I'm very passionate about digitization and sharing collections with people no matter where they're at. Yeah. If you kind of find more that piece you're interested in, you can do a lot with astronomy, even if you decide that's not the career path for you. Mm-hmm. You can still do a lot of really great things with it.
Yeah. And I have a background in arts and performance and love communicating these wonderful ideas to an audience as well, and connecting to an audience. So there's a lot of different pathways to it. Thank you so much for your question. Carolina asked, was Western astrology heavily influenced by Eastern cultures rather than vice versa?
Astrology or astronomy? Do we know? Was it different?
It says astrology. I'm wondering if they're talking about constellations.
Well, maybe a little bit of both. I don't know.
Sure.
It's a complex system, because basically, for example, of course, you'll have Egyptian astrology, you'll have Middle Eastern Islamic astrology. But then, for example, in the case of Islamic science, as we exemplified, Jessica mentioned the Lahore globe. So there's a common astronomical background. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, so up to the 17th century, these two fields, astronomy and astrology, are very much interconnected. So of course you have a circulation of knowledge between these two different but complementary fields and between these different geographical areas.
Yeah, and we have a lot of interconnected knowledge between cultures too. So kind of throughout history, even back in the 2nd century when Ptolemy was making the original kind of 28 constellations, there was a lot of go-between between Persia and some of these other cultures that would have worked its way into Greek mythology and through a lot of our storytelling. So you see it interconnect with, like Pedro said, Egyptian, Islamic, Greek. And so I think it would be probably unrealistic to say they didn't, in some ways influence each other.
Well, to build off that, if each culture had a different take on constellations, would one culture over time have multiple takes on the same constellation? So like when I see Orion today, is that the same constellation grouping as, say, like thousands of years ago?
That's an excellent question, Chris. And actually, we can approach that question from two perspectives: the purely astronomical perspective and the cultural perspective. So astronomically, the question will be, are constellations the same in the sense that the stars remain in the same position? So then you can basically see the same pattern. And the answer is, actually, the positions of stars in the sky, they do change, but very, very slowly. I want to go back to that very good question that came from the audience about, so if you observe stars that are not visible to the naked eye, are they part of the constellation? Yes, they are, but it's only when you go to a high level of precision using modern technology that you can keep track of those changes. So for the practical purpose of you looking up at the sky with our naked eye, you can say that the constellations, in terms of the positions of stars, will remain the same for a very long period of time. So now let's go to the cultural side, which is, what do we see in a certain area of the sky? And also, how do we represent what do we see? Let me use an example of a constellation that comes from the Greek tradition. So on the left, on your screens, you see a depiction of Aquila, the eagle. So this is a constellation that is associated with Greek mythology. And this image comes from a 16th century book, which is one of those early printed descriptions of constellations that actually used for our coloring book. And you see, actually, I think this image was used in the coloring book. It's interesting here because it's representing a constellation you can barely see some stars in the figure. And even the stars you see are actually decorations. So that's not meant to represent the actual stars in the sky. So here, the figure, the idea that represents an eagle, gain its own life. Now, if we move to the image on to the right, to the two images where you see the eagle actually carrying a young man. So that's related to the Greek myth of Zeus sending an eagle, or turning himself into an eagle to kidnap Ganymede. So Zeus was known for doing these kind of nasty things. Then there's also connection with the story from the Roman Empire. So there was a young man whose name was Antinous, and he was very close to the Emperor Adrian. Then he dies, he drowns in the River Nile, and then he becomes deified. So this, so you see that you have even different stories connected with the same constellation. But looking at the image at the center and on top right, you see that in that case, you already have the stars much more noticeable. And in the case of the image on the top right, you even have a grid, because astronomers use systems of coordinates to measure, identify, and communicate the positions of stars with great precision. So see, what you see here is a combination between actual accurate mapping and keeping the figures, the renditions, for reference. But from the 19th century, especially from the mid-19th century onwards, when astronomers started to really map the skies with ever greater precision, they decided, well, do you remember what I said about Lacaille in the south before I was swollen by the wormhole? Well, this is not rational. These are just flights of fancy. What we need is to map the sky. So let's get rid of that. So eventually, the eagle becomes one of those 88 constellations, which is just a very well-defined area of the sky. And that's it. For scientific purposes, that's what we need. All of the rest it's just flights of fancy. Is that irrelevant though? Does it has less value? Absolutely not. Because as we have mentioned several times here, constellations are not just about astronomy. They are about culture, they are about art, they are about mentalities. And we actually have a great project to which everyone can contribute, in which we're trying to learn more about these old depictions of constellations, different depictions for the same constellation, and which will help us learn a lot more about those cultural aspects.
Jessica, can you tell us about it?
I can. I'll actually show it to you.
Oh, great.
So Colleen will drop this in the chat as well, so you can actually participate. But we have a project here at the Adler that we've partnered with Zooniverse.org. And I also encourage you to go to Zooniverse and just see the other projects they've got going on. But ours is called Mapping Historic Skies. And like Pedro said, what we're trying to focus on is this idea that they do change because of cultural norms, art, styles. And if you want to be able to track that, you need to be able to find specific constellations. And the problem is that a lot of our depictions look like these, where there are 10s to 20 to 88 constellations in a single image. So in order to help us get those down to single constellations, there's two workflows you can do on Zooniverse.org. Oh no, we have that bubble. There we go. See, I pulled up the most beautiful picture for you guys. So this one's our marking workflow. And what you actually do is you just come in here and help us separate out the different constellations. So you don't have to really have any knowledge of constellations. You just kind of come in and say, those look like different constellations to me. Mark them out for us. What it'll do is then kind of aggregate those into an individual image. So once 50 other people mark the same constellation you do, so don't worry if you're wrong, 50 other people have to be exactly the same level of wrong. What it does is then gives you something like this. So you go into our classify workflow, and with no knowledge of constellations, we walk you through this. So if you don't know what this is, that's great. We're going to answer some questions. This looks like an object to me. It looks artificial because I've never seen a crown that's made in nature. And all of a sudden we have our answer.
This is great.
And then you just come down here and we've got quite a few options. And then you say you're done. And there you go. You get your next one. So it's something that we've worked really hard with our Zooniverse colleagues to make this possible. And make it pretty easy for you to really do some great work helping us get these kind of done.
Yeah. I love that I don't have to be a professional scientist. I could just be anyone to do this. And you've also said like other ways we can engage with the coloring book, with this, with mapping historic skies. If I want to seek out more, what could I do beyond these two?
Yeah, we've given you two great actionable things. You can help us, classify constellations. You can color in a coloring book and be that artist yourself. But if you're a little bit interested too in hearing more stories, we have an exhibit on Google Arts and Culture. We have a partner page there with 15 great exhibits, but one of them is called Pictures in the Sky. And the entire purpose of this exhibit is to talk about these cultural norms of constellations, how they look in different cultures, how they've developed, and a lot of what you've heard here today. And it'll just give you a little bit more information and help you kind of see even more different images than what we showed you today.
Thank you so much. I just want to say the Adler is all about different perspectives of our night sky, connecting us all in different narratives. And we do that also in our Sky Observers Hangouts. So if you subscribe to YouTube, we get notifications about this. September 21st, we're doing it about Chicagohenge. The sun lines up the buildings in Chicago, but different perspectives from different locations. Another great way to have just a dialogue with people sharing the same sky as you, but seeing it from a different perspective. I want to do this one last question. When you're looking for a specific constellation in an area, is there a center point or a big constellation shape which you look at that you'll know the next one to it, like something that can give you direction when you're looking up there?
Oh, okay. So of course, this will depend on the time of the year and on your location, and also on the visibility in the place where we are in terms of light pollution, etc. But yeah, so I think there will be a few. For example, I can go back to my answer. The first constellation I remember in my context, in the place I grew up. For example, in the winter sky, it would be Orion. And I will also bring in here a different concept, but complementary, which is the concept of asterism. So an asterism is not exactly a constellation, but again, it's a pattern of stars that it's relatively easy to recognize, and which can include stars from different constellations. For example, there are 3 stars that form what we call the summer triangle. They are from different constellations, the Swan, the Lyre, and the Eagle. But it's a very easy shape to recognize in the summer sky, even from Chicago. So you basically need to find for these points of reference so that then you can make sense of the rest of the sky.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. If you have any more questions or we didn't get to yours somehow, you can email those to askadler@adlerplanetarium.org. Colleen can put that in the chat. I want to say thank you for coming. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Pedro, for your beautiful, wonderful stories and your wonderful insights and all answering these great questions. Thank you for your great questions and ideas and perspectives. We do these every 2 weeks. We'll be back next in 2 weeks on September 10th. I'll be back too, actually, with the Aquarius Project, a teen-led hunt for meteorites underwater at the bottom of Lake Michigan. But we encourage your continued participation in astronomy conversations. And because the Adler is currently closed, we'd love if you could donate to the Adler's annual Celestial Ball fundraiser happening September 12th. Any amount is welcome. And also, please, I encourage you to fill out the survey. Please take a moment to fill out the survey, post it in the chat. Let us know how we're doing and what you'd like to see more of. But join us again in 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us through all the technical glitches and bumps, but it was great to speak with you all and talk about stories about our night sky. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.